All right. So welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Pfeiffer, and I'm a regular speaker at Master Gardener events. I'm delighted to join you all today. And I'm going to talk about a topic that I think is a challenge, especially in mature gardens or coming in to acquiring a very old garden that you need to upgrade. So we're going to take a little journey about how to garden successfully amid tree roots. So when I look at a garden that's old as this one is, there's a pretty good assumption that these smaller trees and larger shrubs probably came up with these trees, these large trees, when everybody was a lot younger. Having a mix of large trees in our gardens provides a great aesthetic. It also provides shade that's valuable to protecting the adjacent landscape from heat and sun in periods like we had this last summer. So let's go down this path here of gardening amid trees. So just thinking about what trees are and their place not only in our gardens, but on the planet. Trees have very long lifespans and a permanent architecture. In fact, many tree species, can outlive us by generations. Well, the flip side of that, or perhaps the caveat, is that with that permanent architecture, trees accumulate the history as they grow. So if there are injuries or there's extreme drought stress at a certain growing season, that affects the tissues in the wood that is laid down that year. When trees have injury, they don't heal, they don't replace that tissue. All they can do is grow new wood around the injured wood. And then they have a process of setting up chemical barriers. So in the cross section of this log, we see this black line is actually a chemical deposit that the tree made to help contain decay so that it just doesn't race through all of the rings. And so this is different than this section, which is a natural change in color as the wood ages and becomes heartwood. And you can see here that on the part inside the black lines, the rings aren't as distinct anymore because the wood is breaking down. So this takes energy to compartmentalize and maintain that compartmentalized area through the tree's life. So it's all hidden underneath. We can't always tell that there are old injuries underneath, but when they do occur, know that they become part of that tree's structure and history. Mature trees thrive under stable conditions. So not unlike humans, right? The older we get, the less resilient we are to change. It may take us a little longer to adjust. Some change hard to adjust to at all. So for trees that are in a landscape that have reached that very mature stage, if there are dramatic changes in light and soil condition, or we've impacted areas of roots, that's going to be more problematic for older trees than younger trees. So trees thrive under stable conditions as they mature. And, here's a whole grove. This is a Seattle neighborhood, right? Every time I open up this photo, I'm just stunned. It is near Carkeek Park, so the far background is Carkeek Park, but the foreground and the Chilean fire tree there in the center is the backyard. So we have these trees in our communities where we live, and they do a huge number of things for us. So we have obviously the aesthetic value is one of the first things we might think about. Trees also contribute economic benefits, whether it's about business districts or infrastructure, property values. There are differences in the economics in a region that is well planted with trees. Public health is another huge contribution. They've done studies that find the difference in things such as birth weight and asthma and even heart attack rates comparing neighborhoods that are well treed versus those that aren't. So there's a newer aspect of what trees contribute that we're learning more about these days. And then there's infrastructure. So think about stormwater management, right? Trees are great interceptors of rainfall and slowing down the movement of water. So I could probably go on for another hour about all the benefits that trees give us. So when we're making changes around trees, we want to do gardening. We want to make sure we're protecting that investment that we have. And the biggest place that we end up with unintended damage is misunderstandings about how roots grow and what trees need. So let's look at a few. True or false? The tree roots grow as wide as the canopy, and trees are anchored by deep tap roots. Well, the canopy spread one, false, right? So here's this artist rendering, which I've seen different versions of around, where, here's this idea that, the tree is going to have this mirror image. Now, the reality is there is a balance of canopy area to root area, but it doesn't translate quite like that. It's going to be a little bit more like this. So when they've actually done excavation and studying tree roots, it can go 2 to 3 times as far away from the trunk as that canopy spread is. So thinking about, the anchorage and all the important roots are going to be broad and may extend well beyond the canopy. So if we're doing things around a tree, the closer you get to the trunk, clearly the more root area that is being affected. So thinking about the canopy as an area of activity is, not unreasonable, but know that the roots go a lot farther than that. So every once in a while, I get these really awesome opportunities to really see what's going on underground. And believe it or not, we were moving this mature eastern flowering dogwood, and we had some pretty big equipment going, and I wanted to take as much root ball as we could. So what we did was we dug it really big, and then we were using a fork to sift away some of the soil, so we kind of semi-bare rooted the tree. And what that did is it just gave this beautiful image of, where are the tree roots? So we typically think about the majority of tree roots being in that top foot of soil. And often we'll find really important networks of fine roots within the top 6 inches. And then used to be a smaller diameter roots, and then we were getting some of these larger diameter woody roots. That's part of the anchorage. And then this soil was really well aerated. It was on the sandy side, and it was really aerated for quite a depth. And so it set out, if you look down here, where my arrow is at the bottom center of the screen, and then over here to the left, what it did is it set out another set of lateral roots a couple feet farther down. And that's not uncommon in our forests and in gardens. And we can't tell if that's happening or not in the average garden, but here's some evidence of like where those tree roots are and how they're positioned. So the idea that we have a taproot is also false, right? Those anchoring roots are going to be spreading out broad. So those large diameter roots, anchoring roots, are out broad. The fine roots in this picture, it just pulled away some of the duff layer, and what you see here are tree roots. And there's a nice new growth tip. So a lot of those really fine roots are going to be in that upper 6 to 12 inches of soil. So tree roots can absorb turf products. So here was another example where this is a spruce tree back here, and they were thinking about putting a path in. So we carefully excavated where the path was going to go and saw that we had large lateral woody roots. Those are supporting roots. And we also had a lot of fine roots. And then that also tells you that, you know, those fine roots are there. So if we're putting stuff on this lawn, you know, we're also targeting tree roots. And in situations where herbicides are put down, and particularly for broadleaf herbicides, you can see the burning on these leaves on this maple tree was connected right back to applications of herbicides. So we have a whole nother conversation about when and how we need to use herbicides in our garden. And, you know, I just have another argument of, do we really need to be really careful, because some of those plants it could affect are the ones you want. So how about another myth? Is it okay to add a few inches of soil over the roots? So adding fill soil over roots is can be very harmful. What's happened is, you know, we have all those fine roots that are near the surface, and suddenly the moisture and air getting to them has been greatly diminished. And we'll see people like trying to do some of these things. In some situations, these can be designed to be helpful, but, you know, coming up this close with that deep as this picture shows, you know, not a good idea. And, you know, this is commonly called the arborist back in. And this particular Port Orford cedar had fill grade that was brought in like right to the edge of the canopy. And I think along with it, there was also some changes in drainage pattern. So filling the grade up in the vicinity of that broad spreading root system, or making significant cuts in the grade, can be expected to cause harm. So these are case-by-case scenario of how severe is that impact going to be. And in a construction project like this one is where having arborist guidance early on to make decisions about what might be done with the design and the grade, and, you know, can we effectively preserve the tree or make adjustments to design. So long and short, roots grow where they have air and moisture. So some people will think about, oh, the roots are going to explore the ground till they find it. Well, they're not, right? Because to function metabolically, the roots need air and moisture. So there has to be enough of it there for those roots to grow. And when those conditions are great, well, the roots will proliferate in those locations. So the other thing about roots as well is, you know, these are roots from a Douglas fir tree, and these fine roots those are the ones that are doing that hard work of getting the moisture and nutrients up to the tip top of the soil of the canopy. So if we're mucking around in the soil and we're, you know, disturbing large quantities of tree roots of this size, we're going to set that tree up for some drought stress and damage. And then the other thing, I'm just going to tell you a little fun fact here, if we're looking at this sample, is that there's areas where we see this sort of white coating here. And this is Douglas fir roots with a mycorrhizae association. So also to have good mycorrhizae, they also need good moisture, good soil aeration, and they're also sensitive to chemicals applications of certain types. So things we do to make good conditions for the roots are also going to be helpful to support their companion mycorrhizae. So tree and turf wars, right? This is something in our gardens we're really persistent that, you know, we take these two plant species that come from really opposite ecosystems and we put them right up close together and we say, okay, play nice, right? And for those plants, they're one or the other in the long term is likely to lose out. Now this really cool image came from some research on competition of turf grass with sugar maple and back in the Midwest. And sugar maple is particularly sensitive to turf competition, but we still see similar things happening in our region and for a variety of species. So when there is turf, the turf is going to be really competitive to get the moisture and nutrients out of the soil. It's going to change some of the other dynamics an ecology of the soil in that area. And so we see for the same slice of ground, there's, very low density of tree roots compared to what's happening under a woody mulch. And of course, if we have woody mulch down, that's kind of like what trees grow with in the forest where they're native to. So here's an example. A cherry tree is here behind the little boxwood hedge. And the gardeners were thinking about putting in a pathway here and discovered that, they were immediately getting into these large roots. So the roots were just so intermingled with the turf, and it wasn't obvious until they started pulling the grass away. So in this instance, oh, well, the turf is kind of maybe not doing as well, and we want to start putting a path in here. Well, what was the reason? It was with the trees. So a little different design approach to prevent taking those roots out. So here's a situation where, we see the turf losing as trees mature and cast more shade, and the roots become ever more dense in that inner area near the trunk. The turf will start to fade out. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that the tree roots then become more dense and competitive with the turf roots. But the biggest thing that is happening is about light. And even if we pruned up the tree or we tried to thin it, the quality of light coming through the canopy is not going to be what the turf needs. The foliage of the tree is going to filter out some of that red wavelength of sunlight that's really vital for turf. So without the good light, the turf diminishes. So when I look at a site like this, it tells me that maybe we just don't try to make turf work under here. No matter what we do, it's going to come back to this situation. And it's almost drawn a pretty clean line of where all the conditions shifted enough that the turf could survive reasonably near the tree. So root injury and tree health. The greater the area of roots affected, the greater the potential harm, right? Pretty straightforward, but trees can take a little bit of root pruning or a little bit of disruption. So if you think about maybe that big area around the canopy, and we're just, affecting maybe a quarter or less of what's supplying that tree, not so much. But if we're, really mucking around close to the trunk, we're going to be really severing and disrupting a larger root area that could be more harmful. So this was a tree that was being removed from a garden, but I thought, what a great opportunity to see what things look like underground, right? So you see this at the trunk flare, and from the base of the tree, we have these large woody lateral roots, right? Those are the important stabilizing anchor roots. And so when trees develop that big buttress, that's part of their support system. We don't want to mess with that. And also you see that this area closer to the tree has a lot of big woody area. So there's not as much soil volume right up close to the trunk. So this is an illustration of if we're, severing, maybe this is a grade change, or it could be that, we're running a trench through for some utility or irrigation or whatever. So the farther away you are from the trunk, this top one, the trees probably not going to skip a beat, particularly if it were done during the fall. But if we come closer to the drip line even, you can see how much more of those roots have now been severed. And, we get close to the trunk, well, you could pretty quickly be taken away, nearly half of the root area. And that's pretty bad news. Now, if you were like doing something that, say, you were just, carving out maybe a little area on one side, like, not even a pizza slice, but just kind of like a big bite on the edge of the pizza, if you think about it that way, not as harmful. So sometimes we might choose to, how we align trenching that comes near a tree can also help reduce, just cutting off a big area. So I always shudder when I see these kinds of projects going in. Here's a large Douglas fir, and you can see all these fine roots in that upper 6 inches of soil that have been cut through. And the other thing with this is that this big mature Doug fir is adapted to the site without irrigation. And now we're putting in irrigation heads. We're changing the moisture patterns dramatically. So remember I said in the beginning that, mature old trees thrive with stable conditions. And this is a significant change. So it's going to impose some stress. The other thing is sometimes it's unavoidable. We do need to do some cutting near a tree. And if that's the case, when we've exposed roots, such as this, it's really helpful that we make a really clean cut. And 2 examples where I was working with tree preservation, where we had exposed areas that there had been previous digging. And you can see here that kind of not unlike what happens on a branch, you cut the end off and then you've got this, dormant growth tissue that breaks and grows, releasing new root growth right near that cut. And in the one photo on the right, what I found were these good sized roots that had just been, busted up with the backhoe, and that tissue just simply died back, and we don't see the roots coming back. So making sure that we've left clean cuts, cover it back up, treat it like a new plant, right? When you put a new plant in the ground, it's had all kinds of root pruning and disruption going. We make sure it has adequate water the first summer in the ground, or even just as you do this work, clean it up, cover it up, water it in well, so it has a chance to recover. Don't use rototillers. I'm going to tell you not to use rototillers for any kind of garden prep these days, or take a different approach, but we especially don't want to take a rototiller to try to establish a new garden area around existing trees. It's just going to chew up the roots, something terrible. And then the other thing is just keeping track of, what's going on around this root zone. So it may happen that one year the sidewalk went in and they had to do some significant root pruning. And that amount was decided to be tolerable for the tree. But then the next year, a new group comes in and they don't have an idea that it had that root pruning last year. And it's like, well, let's just put a bunch of really cool landscape plants, and they got large B&B material. And pretty soon now we're exceeding the amount of root damage that this tree might absorb. And in many cases, trying to put in a large bald and burlap shrub or a small tree near large mature trees is very difficult to successfully establish these plants. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation. This was a garden area that the owner thought it would be really cool to have a bunch of rhododendrons with this, upper Doug fir canopy. And there are 2 things that happened here. One, if you look at these rhodies, you can see this one is really bad. This one was dying back. These just aren't thriving. And what you see in the foreground here is where I was finding out that they had really buried the trunks of the trees in the mulch. So adding soil, or that question, can we add a few inches of soil? It's just like really harmful. Soil and mulch, piling it up around that base of that trunk is really stressful and harmful to the trees. And then the rhodies just aren't in an environment that they're able to establish. So they're trying to put in these larger shrubs. I think rhodies are probably amidst the landscape shrubs that can be most difficult to try to get to establish under mature trees. I did note that the sword ferns and the grasses, this different plant complex, were doing a little bit better. They were more compatible, and we'll talk some more about that shortly. So sometimes we love our trees to death. This is an old case study of a consult that I worked on, and I was called in because they were worried about the tree had started dropping big branches in the garden, and they said they really loved their tree, They wanted to do anything they could do to save it, and would I come and see? So what I discovered when I looked up, if you notice here, see these branches are like long poles? Well, they had the canopy thinned out because they wanted to garden underneath it. So now what happened is you had this branch that had numerous old pruning wounds, and then all the new growth was coming out on the end. So you had really heavy foliage on the end, not good support along the rest of the branch because its lateral branches had been taken away. Put that together with old pruning wounds, the wood isn't as strong. And so those branches were starting to break out while they were in leaf. So there was one insult. Now, when we've taken away a lot of leaf area, those leaves also support the roots. So, we have an impact there, especially for over thinning. Now, this is the same tree. And it's a little bit like that line drawing I showed you about putting in a large balled and burlap specimen close to the tree. So here was Chinese dogwood that, was planted, I don't know if this was even 2 feet from the trunk. And when I went all the way around the trunk, what I found where the irrigation water was spraying and keeping the trunk wet is this is root rot. This is a result of a root rot decay fungi that is starting into the base. And so this is fruiting bodies of the fungi at the base of the tree. It's like in the wood. Can't reverse this now. So, so this big tree actually ended up being a total loss. Here's another example. This is also big leaf maple where new irrigation was put in. And so this irrigation spray is wetting this area of the trunk and starting to see some deterioration of the trunk on that side. And then same tree on the right, but the opposite side where there was irrigation spraying the other side of the trunk. And so I see the sap that is weeping through the trunk. That's a sign that the vascular system is deteriorating and the sap is coming through. And then what I saw here was that one of the large support lateral roots had actually been decayed, and the tree was sending out these smaller new roots trying to compensate for it. So those small roots may help trying to get some moisture out, but this tree's lost its anchorage because that root had been rotten. So that's the terrible thing that can happen if we're putting irrigation up against trees and constantly wetting that trunk that's not built to be wet during the summer. And then the other thing that's not so great for trees is doing things like putting this fabric up and burying that buttress area. So what happens over time is that these fabrics can tend to fill up with fine particles that are sitting on top, and then they don't let air and moisture through so well. And so now we're going to be setting this tree up to have depleted soil, inadequate oxygen, and adequate moisture to the roots. And that's going to be pretty stressful to it. So these non-biodegradable weed barriers, and especially covering that area. I call this section of the tree where the trunk transitions into the roots and there's a buttress area, I call that the Achilles heel. Because any insult that we do to this zone of the tree is going to have much greater impact than if those things occurred farther away from the trunk or farther up the trunk, as it were, than if it hit right here near the ground. So truth be told, trees get really angry when we do these things, when we don't listen to what it is they need and how they grow. So if we take a moment and just really observe and appreciate how trees grow and prioritize the changes in the gardens to acknowledge and honor that, then we can keep everybody happy, hopefully. So I'm just going to pause very briefly, Savannah, and ask if we have any questions that have come in about what I've covered so far.
No questions yet, but if you guys have questions, please submit them in the Q&A tab and we'll get to them at the end.
Okay. Well, we will forge ahead and feel like I'm right on schedule with content. So we'll have we'll have good time available to answer questions at the end. So the approach I like to take is just thinking about low impact methods of gardening under big trees is going to increase the success for our new plantings and preserving our tree at the same time. So let's look at what some of those are. So we want to avoid significant root pruning. And in many instances, it might mean just doing some hand digging, being careful and, digging with a shovel and doing it in a way that we're careful that we're not banging and slicing into the roots with the shovel. In this photograph, we needed to install a drain line for a garden because the excess water was actually killing a lot of the trees in that space. And so we needed to run a drain line to connect with a catch basin up this way. And we used a tool that's called an air spade, or sometimes it's called a Demanic soil knife. This hooks up to an air compressor. And so work done by an arborist and with good protective gear and gently, literally blowing the soil away. And this one, I remember us looking at the buttress on the cedar tree and where we thought the roots angled to. And once we got down to here, we said, oh, it did different stuff once it got underground. So this was so valuable. It helped us determine where to hand dig and where to let the equipment come in and do some of the trenching. And then even on some of the smaller diameter roots, these are probably like around an inch and less, but it was still there, they have a important supply to the tree. So by doing this, we could slide the pipe in underneath and get our job done and keep our tree in good shape. The other thing is to minimize grade changes. So this was a red maple tree, and they were redoing the landscape, and we actually eliminated turf that had been around here. And what you're seeing here is a top dressing to make an even grade, and the closer they got to the trees, we're getting down to maybe like, fraction of an inch depth. So we want to protect, we don't want anything coming up against that buttress area. And then the farther away we move from the tree, we had a little more flexibility where we needed to, level it out so we had good drainage. The other thing with this situation is a little hard to see here, but this grade was also done in a way that there would be positive drainage away, because you don't want to put that trunk in a bowl so that in really heavy rains, it's just sitting, literally in a bowl of water. So part of the grading that was done here was that there would be positive movement away from the base of the tree as well. So we want to minimize grade changes, want to avoid severe grade cuts, and we also want to avoid surface changes that, could also, if didn't bury the tree, but maybe changed and started having surface water accumulating near the tree where it hadn't before. So being careful with grade changes. The other is to use smaller size nursery stock and fall planting. This is an ideal season if you're looking to adjust plantings beneath large trees. And if we're using smaller size nursery stock, we won't have to dig as big of holes. And also those smaller plants tend to be able to get established easier than very large scale. So the combination of those two things is really significant. Much more success for the nursery stock and the trees we're working around doing this in the fall rather than the spring. And then look for plants to give you interest and color that are going to naturalize, that you don't need to go in and dig up frequently, right? So some of our favorite perennials, you get about 3 or 4 years in max maybe, and it's like, well, I got to dig this up, split it apart, put it back in the ground. Those perennials, they belong in a different bed. But things such as this autumn crocus water lily, this is one of my favorites. This is actually very drought tolerant bulb, and it's a great one. It's in bloom right now in my garden. And it's one of the great choices we have to introduce some color and interest underneath. The next thing would be using a surface irrigation system to help establish the new plants in the proximity of our large trees rather than doing trenching and underground systems. So on the left is drip emitter tubing, and these emitters are installed at desired locations. The rest of the piping is solid on the surface. Sometimes people get concerned with these because it truly is easy, and I have done it. Is if you're not watching, you can put a spade fork through this pretty easily. The other side of it is, though, doing a sort of cut and paste repair on the damaged section of the pipe is a lot easier than if you have leaks that were happening in PVC pipe underground, which, you know, is a bigger challenge. But mostly this is a great way to, you know, give really targeted water to the new plants and not disrupt the tree roots. Soaker hose for small areas can also be a very effective way to help new plants get established. And then again, I mentioned earlier about, you know, not burying around the trunk, but here's an example, you know, where weed barrier has been put down and tree roots ended up growing over the top. Taking it up is going to be difficult, and it's just doesn't bode for healthy soil conditions. And I'm also not a fan of cardboard. A lot of folks will say, oh, I'm going to get this area ready to plant, and they're working under big trees and they'll put sheets of cardboard down. That cardboard, you know, has a lot of waxes in it. It's thick, and it can interfere with air and moisture movement at, you know, important times of the growing season for the plant. And yeah, I'm just not in favor of putting barriers down that are going to impede moisture and air movement, and also the important soil organisms that need to move up and down. So when you're planning what to do, again, we're kind of looking at this tree I showed earlier, is that it's kind of told you where you're not going to mess around, right? So I'm not going to try to dig or add anything significant in this area. I will come in and do some gentle top dressing with compost and wood chips, or sometimes just even the wood chip mulch alone. As I come out to this perimeter, then I can start maybe looking at putting in some larger quantity or a little larger plants, but I still want to be careful not to dig in a way that I'm severing all the way around that line, right? So be careful about digging. So here's an example. I have a general rule of thumb. If it's a big tree, I want to stay like 3, maybe 4 feet away before I put anything in. And this is a picture of my garden years ago, and I got some low Oregon grape established. And over time, it started coming in closer to the tree. So if you introduce things that will naturalize either through spreading by their roots or by seed, and I actually think some of this Mahonia near the trunks was the birds dropping the seeds from the branches after they'd eaten the berries. So those are both reasonable things. I still come through and I remove the plants that might start growing up against the trunk. And I just feel a good rule of thumb is to have that trunk flare exposed, one, just so that it stays nice and dry, and also that I can see it, because sometimes there may be problems that are being hidden if you have a lot of vegetation really dense and tight up against the trunk. This was red maples, and what you see here is mostly moss. There's very little grass. So if I see a situation like this, there's no need to bring in any kind of sheet mulch. What we have here is a blend of woody mulch with a fair amount of compost blended in with it. And so we are gently spreading it. Here's our zone of, you know, leave that Achilles heel area alone. It already had these nice little spring bulbs. This was actually March when this photo was taken, but I would do this exact thing at this time of year. If you'll note, when we spread the material, we are not deeply burying these surface roots, because the wood on those roots is kind of adapted to being exposed to the air. So if we were to throw, you know, try to cover it deeply, that could be harmful for that wood. So what we did do is fill in the depressions and, you know, just have not too much coverage over the roots. Once I've done this, many of the plants that, you know, are compatible with growing under the tree, you might be able to just like spread the root balls and just really kind of have it into the interface between the soil surface and this new material you put down. So that's another way to avoid digging hundreds of holes underneath the tree. In some situations, the turf may be super dense, and if the turf is really dense, then you can't mulch super deep to try to smother the grass. And in those situations, I would consider using newspaper. And the way I've done that is we have 4-ply, so not too thick, and optimally doing this kind of like at the end of the summer when the grass is kind of weaker anyways, especially if you're non-irrigated. And then put the paper down, wet it, and immediately cover it with 2 to 3 inches of wood chip mulch. You're going to have to work by hand right around the trees. So see here, we kind of had a zone where we didn't put any mulch or newspaper near the base of the trunks of these trees that were in this garden. But then we put this down and then we just let nature do the work. The newspaper, especially kept wet and done going into the fall, generally starts deteriorating pretty well and becoming part of that mulch layer. But if I can get the job done just by using surface applications of compost or mulch, that's what I'm going to do. You know, it's really not, I don't know how to say it. I think a lot of people feel that it's immediately necessary. And the thing is, if we put down this woody mulch and some of the grass comes back through or some weeds come back through, they're generally going to be sparse and they're usually much easier to pull out once they've been, the ground has been conditioned and softened by that mulch. So important, the material you want to use when you're gardening underneath trees. Arborist wood chips and leaf mold are my 2 top choices. Those decomposed leaves that you've saved from your own garden are probably about the best mulch you can put down. And then incorporating wood chips or keeping some woody debris in the mix. And then compost from, you know, just good, clean, well-processed compost can be helpful in some situations. If the soil has become really depleted, having some compost along with the woody material helps the soil build a natural profile again, and emulating the kinds of soil systems that trees grow with in the forest, which is with a loose duff layer and then a layer of highly composted organic material. We often call that the O horizon, the organic horizon. And then beneath that, the top of the soil is going to have a higher concentration of organic matter, and then it diminishes as you go down. So if we use these materials at the surface, we're emulating what nature does. So here was maple trees that previously they'd been trying to grow turf under unsuccessfully. And this was a college campus, Oregon State campus. And so they put these large logs in to help protect the new plants from the students walking through these beds, which they'd been used to do. And the nice thing is that as these logs decompose, they also help condition the soil and support beneficial fungi and insects to make for a good soil environment. And then the plants that are brought in are a variety of native woodland perennials and ferns, and you can use many of our garden perennials are adapted to similar kind of habitat. And so putting those kinds of plants together, starting with smaller stock, doing it in the fall, and over time you will have this nice complex of healthy plants instead of dead grass under the trees. So really looking at what's happening, a lot of gardeners are worried about moss. And this was in the Japanese garden. And, you know, they like the moss there. I just looked at this mix of, you know, moss and the ferns, and it's like this was the appropriate cover in this area. And between the light and the tree competition, you know, maybe that's the aesthetic. So working with what the site is telling you will grow well there, and not trying to force things that aren't adapted. This is a great example that I saw at a colleague's garden. So a small front yard, and this saguaro cypress in the front. And she told me that when she first bought her house, that this whole area was lawn. And then every year that the saguaro got a little bigger, the lawn got a little sicker. And so she converted that area to be this large swath of epimedium ground cover. The day I was there was in the early spring, and she had just mowed down the epimedium and was getting ready to lay, replenish a mulch cover over the ground. And it gave me an opportunity to see how she'd organized the planting. So if you'll notice, there's no epimedium or soaker hose in this area. So it was mulch, and it was done in a way that the Achilles heel here is nice and exposed, wasn't messed with. And then she wound the soaker hose through the area, so it helped provide enough water for that epimedium to take root well. And so in the growing season, you would see this beautiful carpet of leaves. And there's a picture of the type of ground cover she had there, epimedium, or it's called bishop's cap. We have tons of cultivars. I think this is one of my most favorite selections for planting with big trees. It really likes that environment, and there are different cultivars that have different leaf venation. There's yellow and red and white flowers. There's a lot of variety. It's a great selection. So taking lessons from the forest. If we look in our region in the woods, and we see growing the types of plants that are growing there. We have ferns, we have low Oregon grape, we have salal, oxalis, long list. What kinds of plants grow with our trees and build our gardens that way? So here was a cultivated garden, and we have some native plants. Here's our low Oregon grape. Near us is a western red cedar and a Douglas fir. Here's oxalis. Here's epimedium leaves on the right, and sarcococo on the far left. So we have a mix of native and ornamental plants that are working in this proximity. This was an area that used to be lawn, and definitely weak lawn. And so the first thing that was done was that they mulched this whole area. They added the ferns. It's a little hard to tell, but this area between the trees and all the way around here, they left an open zone. They didn't plant right up against the trunk. But doing the ferns toward the front of the bed gives you the appearance of a full planting. And they have some Oregon grape. And then the following years when I came by, I saw that then they started introducing some other types of native flowering plants like bleeding heart and fringe cup and that sort of thing. So the other thing is, don't have to try to get all those plants in a single year. If you do it in stages, that also helps reduce the amount of root disruption. So some examples. This is a Dunn garden. When they have these beautiful perennial beds around the large Douglas fir. This is a Vancouveria inside out flower and iris that have established very well. In fact, the Pacific Coast iris are pretty nice selection. So here's a distant view of this bed. So we have, I think this was actually type of sedum. We have iris. The purple flowers are allium. That's another bulb that's pretty well adapted. But then all of these plants that they're planted in, and then they're ones that they can just naturalize. We don't have to go in there and be digging up repeatedly. So you can really get some beautiful palette without trying to put a lot of material in right off the bat. So now I'm going to take a few minutes and go through some of my sort of utility plants that I find really successful, and ways to just start getting good cover. So if you have some shade, Fragaria vesca woodland strawberry can make really great cover. It's great for pollinators. It's great for birds. It's great for us. There's really tasty little strawberries. One caveat I will say, I have it in my garden, and there's an area where I encouraged it. And it's one of the things I weed out in other areas, but I can think of worse things to have to pull out, and it comes up pretty easy. But when you have areas that, you really need to get that good coverage in and our partial shade, this is a great thing to start with. And you don't need to dig deep holes. You can just nestle that into the mulch. Another one that comes with a word of caution, this is for large scale gardens where you have big trees and you're having trouble getting cover. Oregon oxalis is really great. So this is a picture from Washington Park Arboretum, and all of this carpet area is Oregon oxalis. And this Douglas fir, striped bark maple, there's some rhodies. And one of the things that really attracted me to Oregon oxalis in the years that I worked at the Arboretum was that we didn't see as much herb robert coming up where the Oregon oxalis was. So it seems to have this kind of root zone density that isn't friendly for other weeds to come up through. That said, if it gets on the boundaries that you want after it's established for several years, it can, kind of cover over things like heaths and heathers and some, those low prostrate shrubs. So use it with some caution, but I also feel like it's underutilized in areas where we're having trouble keeping good cover under trees. Here's another landscape where they had a combination of oxalis, some epimedium on the left, Japanese painted fern, and actually I realize there's a maidenhair fern there. So combining different types of these woodland perennials is a great thing. This is oxalis iron cross. I really like this one as well. It is a little more tame than the Oregon oxalis. It doesn't spread as intensely. It's very drought tolerant, and it has this wonderful leaf color and flower color in the summertime. It is deciduous, so it will totally disappear through the winter time, but it will be up for the summer. So here was a kind of those spots that are really challenging. Big western red cedar. There's nothing, you can't even dig here, right? Because of ground, it was like a lot, just woody roots there. And there were all these rocks. And so this owner was saying to me, she's like, I just look at this, this bare zone. What could I do? And my thought was, put in some strawberry ground cover that's just going to be really happy just nestling right between those rocks without digging holes. So we have some that have great color, and also our native beach strawberry would be another great choice for a location like that. Mixed sedum. I have been playing with these guys and finding that they can grow in a lot more different light conditions than we might first expect. I love the mixed sedum because you can get a variety of foliage colors that make for really good visual interest, even if there aren't flowers. And then, of course, all of these sedum blooms, and these sedum are great blooms for pollinators. When you get it in a flat like this, you can just set it right on the ground, right? You just kind of roughen up that surface a bit and nestle it in with the mulch, so you don't have to dig deep holes to get the cover. And they also propagate really well. Any of you who like to garden with sedum know that you can just take a bunch of those stems and put them in a flat or even scatter them straight in the garden, and they'll root pretty readily. And that's exactly what I did in this area. So this is an incense cedar. And I've got native strawberry out to the left side of the bed, but as we got closer to the tree and it was shadier, and this is like the north side of the tree you're looking at, I just had this big bare mulch area. And this sedum I had growing in another part of the garden, and when it was in full sun, it was like overwhelming the other sedum that it was mixed with, and so I didn't like that. So I pulled it up and I literally just nestled those cut stems into this area, and it established well. It actually has a much nicer stature with a little less sun, and it blooms. I've got these great yellow flowers coming in. So gosh, that was just one of the best fixes I've ever found. So don't underestimate where and how we can use sedum at the surface. Here's another garden with a challenge. This is a mature Japanese maple. This is a really nice dwarf Mount Vernon cherry laurel underneath it. That's also it's a great companion. But then this area between light and I think, moisture competition, the soil got, really kind of depleted. And boy, what are we going to do here? So one of the first things I would do is scarify the surface of this soil. I'm not going to turn it over because I'm going to be messing up with the tree roots, but just crumbling that crusted surface and then introducing wood chip mulch or introducing a layer of like a 1/4 inch of compost and then some wood chips on top of that. We could come in and start introducing some low height plants because this is near the sidewalk. So we didn't want tall plants anyways. We want things that are going to be lower than this shrub back here. Here's some sea thrift in the corner. That was doing pretty good. We're going to hang on to that and, scrape away the grass, introduce some mulch. And here are the kinds of things I would introduce. This is a cyclamen coum. This one comes up in the winter and the leaves are up all winter. This beautiful flower usually opens sometime between January and February, and it is intermingled with kinnikinick. Lily of the Valley. That's another one that, people have in their gardens. Maybe some people wish they could get rid of it. But in really tree root competitive situations, this may be the plant to grow. And it also will kind of crowd out other things. It can be grown in combination with other shrubs. Here's a Pieris here on the left. And I think this was the type of Daphne here on the right. But your grandmother's lily of the valley could be used, or use our native false lily of the valley, Myanthemum, and it's got these wonderful flowers. This one kind of favors areas that have a little more moisture. I actually have it underneath large conifers with facing east. And what it does is lasts pretty well through most of the growing season. And then getting around August, the leaves start yellowing and it goes dormant. But it comes back up again when the soil gets moist again next year. If it's in areas that are more moist, the leaves will stay through to the fall. But it's a great one to use underneath large trees. Another one I like is dwarf comfrey. Symphytum grandiflorum has these white flowers. This is another one, if it's an extremely dry shade, that it will kind of shrink back and go dormant, almost like the way our lawns do. And then when we get to like this time of year, it'll like perk back up and flush with leaves. A little word of caution, I would say probably took somewhere between 10 and 15 years in my garden. It like got along one edge and just said, wow, the conditions are good over there. And it kind of marched kind of quickly on me. But it took it a long time to do that. And in areas where the tree competition is greater, it's just really stayed very confined to the area that I planted it. So to think about this one for kind of a tough, dry shade situation. And then Pacific Coast iris. Iris are great companions combined with ferns. And here you see it with our Fragaria chiloensis along with it. So yeah, you can have like great flowers and color beneath trees with the right plant. And then the old-fashioned hellebore, the old hellebore orientalis is great for naturalizing under large trees. Washington Park Arboretum, there were beds where the hellebore were probably there for 40 years or more beneath tall Douglas firs and western red cedars. And they didn't really get any particular attention at all. And the nice thing about them is when they died down, they kind of created their own mulch cover, which helped suppress weeds. And then, they come up and bloom. Some of the newer cultivars may also be useful, but I really find the old-fashioned hellebore orientalis to be most durable, where you have really big trees and more shade and root competition. Sarcococa humilis, this is another one. I really like this plant because it spreads by underground stems. And so it's one also that you can introduce from smaller stock, kind of at the perimeter, and then as it establishes, it will fill the area in. And it's nice and low to put, near the front of beds. Hardy geranium, this one is just really a good player. So here's a picture of it in early spring beneath some western red cedars. And it's the one that has the purple flowers, and again, another bee-friendly species to introduce. So, with the right techniques and good cultivation, great respect for the ecology of what the soil and the landscape content should be around trees, we can have much nicer gardens with much less headache and work by putting together some of these techniques. And so sometimes you may just need to recognize that nature didn't intend plants to grow there, and it may take a different approach to what the landscape should be near our big trees. So with that, I am ready to open up for questions.
Thank you so much for that lovely information-packed presentation. We did have some questions come through, so let's get to it. First question from Bobby: is it okay to cover exposed larger roots with soil or mulch? I have a plum tree that has some larger lateral roots that are above ground.
So you don't want to fully bury those roots, but I would introduce, I'd probably try to work with, well-aged mature compost, and put it in so that you're like between the height of the root, so that maybe the very top of the root is still exposed, but the material has covered it kind of up to the shoulders, right? Just like up to the edges. You can also, I'm got sight unseen, it's a little hard to judge, but in some situations, I will just, use the wood chip mulch that way. But you don't want to put, like a couple inches of compost or mulch directly over those roots, because that bark has kind of adapted to be exposed to air. So I would just use a little caution there, but I definitely recommend when that happens, do fill in so that you can, not have that severe grade change. Yeah.
The next question is irrigation water on the trunk equally damaging between firs and other deciduous trees?
So if you have mature trees that have been growing along without moisture there, and we have irrigation, and so what's happening during the summer, that Achilles heel area is being moistened with regularity. It favors the proliferation of fungi that are usually not active at that time of year, and it also weakens the bark tissue. I've seen some situations where the impact sprayer coming in is actually gouged a section of the bark where the water hit. Yep, that's bad news. That's where I see more problems. So if your irrigation system is doing that, I would look at things that might need to be done to redesign that system. It may mean capping the head or putting a different spray style on so that the moisture stops short of the trunk.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and for all trees, that doesn't matter the species, deciduous, conifers.
Okay, the next question, what would you do for street trees that the roots travel through the sidewalks besides picking a different tree?
Yeah. So it's hard to tell from that question. So if you have like existing situation where the sidewalk is heaving because of the roots, sometimes it's possible to replace the sidewalk and changing the grade a bit to accommodate that. Occasionally we can do some modest root pruning to deal with repairing the sidewalk. It's all about the percentage of damage, like how much around the tree that you've done. Now in some situations, if it's a really big tree and we're taking out like 6-inch diameter roots, then, that's pretty tough. Sight unseen, that it's kind of a little hard to say, and like how much it's heaving, but that's initial thoughts I can offer. And indeed, it does help to think about the species of tree and like how large a buttress it develops as it matures to the width of the street tree bed. And the other thing that happens with street tree plantings, that soil is confined or compacted and it's not very deep, then the roots are going to be more prolific and bigger near the surface and more likely to heave the sidewalk than if we had a good deep soil profile.
Great, thank you. Carolyn would like to know if most of the plants that you listed are deer resistant.
I wish I could tell you that 100%. I'm not completely clear on that. I don't believe deer bother iris or oxalis. Off the top of my head, I'm not completely sure. So I would suggest one, and this is the other thing I found, because I have a couple friends that live out in Deer Browse territory, and sometimes like the taste is regional. And, one plant isn't a problem for one gardener, and in this other part of the state, it's like, oh yeah, the deer just, go for that plant. So I'm sorry, you'll have to double check. But I think a good number of them, especially the bulbs and the like oxalis type ground covers and the cyclamen, would not be bothered by deer.
Okay. Patricia asks, you use the term mature compost. Could you define what this is exactly and where to find it besides in the home compost pile?
Yeah, so mature compost is when, if you looked at a handful of that compost, it would be almost more like the texture of soil, right? So you just have a lot of small, fine particles. You can't recognize a leaf stem or a little section of leaf. You can't recognize an acorn cap. It's like those pieces, little tiny twigs, those aren't there anymore. So that compost is just really, really broken down to where it's most of the way decomposed. And that gets to be, I don't know how to say it, that when I talk about using that, if I had soil that was really deficient in organic matter and I wanted to kind of jumpstart that natural soil profile, then that really highly finished compost is what's going to be a good material, whether it's coming from your home garden or if you're acquiring it from a supplier. That said, if you have compost that's like decomposing leaves and clean garden debris, and it's most of the way decomposed, but there's some woody chunks in it and you're gardening under trees, that would be still great to use. So that helps.
Let's see, the next question. My neighbors have a mature Douglas fir that borders my fence line. They are building a new house, so the roots have been disturbed this year. How long should I wait to plant a new privacy tree on my side of the fence? I would plant about 15 feet from the trunks.
So, yeah, that's very thoughtful of you, because that tree now is going to need some time to recover from what's happened on that side. So a couple things I can think about is one of the recommendations we have for how to figure out the best distance to keep to reduce the damage is think about a 1 foot radius for every inch of trunk diameter. So the truth is, if this tree was, say, 30 inches, it was a really big tree, and the trunk diameter, not the circumference, but the diameter is measured at 30 inches, then anything that happens 30 feet away from that tree, not likely to do a thing. Then we come to, like, say, the inner half of that. So that would be 15 feet from the trunk. Disturbance that happens from the trunk to that 15 feet is going to be pretty significant. So we want to be very careful. We actually want to avoid disrupting any area there if we can help it. So those are like some things to think about. So if you're like kind of toward that perimeter of that that circle that I just described, that radius, then you're less likely to have much impact. So the closer you are ending up being, then I would probably wait. I'd probably wait a little longer. But the other thing would be is if you used planting in a way that you are severing through roots. So when I showed those pictures about hand digging and exposing like where the roots are, if you do some of that carefully and maybe, you know, prepare the hole with a spade fork instead of a regular shovel, and then either get a bare root tree or semi-bare root, what you're planting in. Dormant, I do favor dormant season planting. So sight unseen, I can't tell. If it feels like, wow, this could be like a big impact, it might be worth waiting till next fall. If it seems like it's not a huge impact, using careful techniques, you might do it, I would say, like waiting till November, till things are really dormant and the soil has, you know, gotten a chance to be more fully hydrated.
Okay, great. See, we've got just a couple minutes left, so I'll try to get through some of these last questions. But Tanya says she has a small urban front yard with 2 huge cedar trees. I want to remove an unsuccessful old lawn. When the lawn is removed, do I apply soil followed by wood chips for future plantings?
Great question. So going back to my discussion about not tilling and such, and saving the gardeners back. The lawn is weak, it sounds like, because of how these trees are. I would say even trying something like a string trimmer, so you kind of just scalp the lawn. So skip the digging, just, you know, bring a string trimmer by and just kind of shave those grass blades down as close as you can, and then put arborist wood chips right on top. And then through, you know, this fall and into like March, even, you can start introducing some of these other kinds of ground covers we talked about. But yeah, if you can avoid like the work for yourself and the disturbance of the soil to prepare a planting bed, that's the way to go around trees.
Okay. We'll do one more, I think. When mulch has built up or a garden immediately surrounding a tree trunk, and the tree has developed newer, smaller surface roots that have circled the trunk, should they be removed? Yes. I have inherited this situation on a monkey puzzle tree that is probably about 40 to 50 years old.
Oh, well, you know, in that case, I think you might want to have an analysis there. You might even be able to tell yourself, but if the circling roots have been there a really long time and they're large diameter and they're kind of embedding into the trunk, I would have an arborist look at it to determine what would be appropriate. If it's a situation where you have just really fine matted roots that are kind of coming up around, then I would carefully slice those out, maybe do a quadrant at a time, and start, you know, moving the soil away from burying the base of the trunk.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're just about at time, so I don't know if we didn't get to everyone's questions, but is there maybe a way that they can contact you directly if they've got some unanswered questions?
Yep. So there's my website, and my email is actually chris@christinapfeiffer.net, and you can see what I have going on, and you can my email is listed there as well, and my month-by-month gardening in the Pacific Northwest is also on your marketplace. I think many people in this audience are already familiar and with this text, but for those that aren't, there it is. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Chris.